Good morning. So my name is Rhonda Farley, and I want to welcome you today to this presentation that we will be delivering on the National Workplace Wellness Policy for Barbados. So just a little bit, thank you for joining us. As I said, I am the officer within the Ministry of Labor, Social Security and Third Sector, responsible for workplace wellness. And this morning, I want to thank the Ministry of Educational Transformation for giving us this opportunity to share with you a little bit about the policy. All right, so I'm going to give you a little bit of background information. We're having persons joining all the time, so I don't want them to miss out on what I have to say. So the policy really was conceptualized by Mr. Orlando Gabby Scott. He worked with the Barbados Workers Union, and he was a stalwart in the field of safety, occupational safety and health. And in addition to Mr. Scott, Professor Trevor Hassel also did a lot of work with him. Together, they did a lot of work in terms of advancing workplace health and wellness. Now, the policy was drafted by Professor Dwayne Devenish, and we have him here with us today. He will deliver your presentation. And in 2019, the Ministry of Labor took it to the cabinet, and it was approved then as the National Workplace Wellness Policy for Barbados. Following that, we established a working committee, the National Committee on Wellness in the Workplace, and that committee is chaired by the Minister responsible for Labor, the Honorable Colin Jordan, and co-chaired by the General Secretary from the Barbados Workers Union, Ms. Tony Moore. Now, the committee has the mandate to oversee and manage the implementation of the policy and also to monitor the effectiveness of the policy strategies. As I said, that committee is the national committee. We also have a subcommittee, which is responsible for the promotion and awareness of the policy. And really, the implementation, spearheading the implementation of that policy. Again, that committee is headed by Professor Devenish. We sit on both committees, and therefore, that is why you're seeing us here this morning. A little bit of aside from that, we've been doing some webinars this year, and we have members of both from the committee and subcommittee who would be assisting in delivering those webinars. You'll hear a little bit more about that later. So a little bit now about Professor Dwayne Devenish, who is our presenter for today. He is a professor of management and of organizational behavior in the Department of Management Studies under the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of the West Indies, the Clearfield campus. And as I said before, he's a member of our committee, and he has the subcommittee. So we're not going to get into much more than that for Professor Devenish. And because that you are giving us your time, I'm going to hand over now to Professor Devenish so he can speak to you some more about the policy. So, Professor Devenish, over to you.
Thank you, Rhonda.
Yes.
And let me express a good morning and a warm welcome to all of our participants here. Of course, I believe that represent the teaching community. And let me also thank the Ministry of Labor, Social Security, and the Third Sector, as well as the Ministry of Education Transformation for making this event a reality. Now, I'm happy that Ms. Farley has chronicled the sequence of events that led to the culmination of the National Workplace Wellness Policy. And I don't want to then rehash that history and chronology, but my role today is really to present the substance of this national workplace wellness policy. Now, let me start by saying before I go into the presentation that as chair of the subcommittee on the National Workplace Wellness Policy implementation, before we actually started the subcommittee, it was not surprising to learn, and this is coming from, because I think we started around something in 2022, 2023, between those years, in earnest, I think.
Yes, yeah.
Yes. But the
2020.
policy was approved in 2019, as Ms. Farley highlighted. And coming after, I mean, COVID-19 pandemic, we were in a hiatus, as you were all well aware, especially the implementation of the policy from 2019 being approved by the cabinet, that it was not surprising to learn that very few Barbadians, even professional, those in the professional sectors, from accounting, the private sector, the public sector, of course, that would include teachers and other types of professionals and workers, that they did not even know that a national workplace wellness policy was in place, and that we've actually started to roll out the awareness and educational initiatives. So when we started the subcommittee, which was a subset of the wider, what we call the Oversight National Workplace Wellness Committee, we wanted to kind of take on, at least for the first couple of years, the responsibility of educating the wider publics, of course, which would make up the employed and the unemployed and underemployed in Barbados, about the National Workplace Wellness Policy, and of course, about national workplace wellness in general. And let me just say that as I start this presentation on what this National Workplace Wellness Policy is all about, I will be keeping an eye on the comments. I know Ms. Farley will be doing the same. And I just saw a comment here by Melanie about everyone is muted, the videos are off. And I should say that because of the size of the audience that we have in Zoom, we had to resort to a webinar arrangement. So in Zoom, as you know, there's several types of formats. Now, the webinar arrangement accommodates larger groups or larger populations. So that's why we have over 200 people here. But the trade-off is that you won't be able to have videos on and speak with your mics. So I still want this particular session to be interactive, but the level of interaction would probably be at the level of the comments and chats that you can actually put within the feature, the comments section here. But we, unfortunately, because of how webinars work in the system, we don't have that functionality of the mics and the videos for participants. If we had fewer people, like under 100, I believe, we would have what we call the traditional Zoom arrangement. And I've seen another comment by R. Paul, and I think Paul, and this is Paul, who's our IT consultant with the Ministry of Labor. I'm seeing this comment about people having issues joining, saying it reached the full capacity. So I'm not sure if we probably have, because I know Zoom places a ceiling on the size of the group, even though it's in a webinar arrangement, because we are actually at 500.
Yeah.
And it is.
Professor?
Yes.
Morning.
Yes, over to you.
Yes. So Paul is going to speak to some what we're doing now with the IT. So, Paul, over to you.
Yes, morning. Right. I was saying, right, persons can raise their hand and we can open the mic for them if they need to speak.
Excellent.
Right. And I'm trying to see if I could get a link in the background that they could follow on YouTube. The ones that can't get in.
Okay. So we will let them know.
Right. So I'm working on that now.
Okay. So the participants who've actually made comments and people trying to join, if you have connections with those people, just let them know that we're trying to work in the background on making this kind of a live stream on YouTube. And of course, I was corrected that we do have access to functioning mics. So it just means that in the webinar, our IT consultant would allow for you to come in. So if you do have questions, please raise your hands, and we will see you. What I'll try to do is to have, I can accommodate this as kind of interactive during my presentation. But if you want to wait to the end, because I'm not going to make a very long presentation, but if you want to wait to the end, you could also raise your arm and we can have a conversation. So let's get into what the National Workplace Wellness Policy is. So effectively, I think Ms. Farley documented it very well, or highlighted it very well, that we as a country, of course, is going through a tremendous set of burdens. And I say burdens plural. We have an NCD burden in the sense that things like cancer, hypertension, diabetes, what we call the non-communicable diseases are actually plaguing the younger and the older populations, all right, in our country. And we're seeing that in terms of not the fact that we have an aging population, but the fact that we're aging unhealthily. So that's something very important to notice or to note. The fact that, yes, we have a large population of older people, which is a good thing that we have a kind of a situation where we have a lot more older people than other groups of countries. The problem is that in our aging population, there are a lot of unhealthy profiles that we are picking up. The second thing that we want to recognize, and then this is all back before COVID, was the fact that we do still have a number of infectious diseases, STIs, for example. We still have a significant spread of other types of illnesses that are communicable now. These are the ones that can spread. And then we saw COVID came, and then we saw how the kind of burden that was placed on our healthcare sector in that pandemic environment. So that's a kind of a prevailing justification for having such an important policy. Now, the question of how we engage in certain habits, and this is where the focus is on wellness versus health, because I know many people argue about I thought we have a health plan already. Why do we need a wellness policy? Now, wellness and health are two different things, even though they're part of the same well-being profile of an individual. Health speaks to where you are in terms of certain things that you may have, conditions. For example, you can go to the doctor, for example, and do a blood test, check your kidneys, check your blood pressure, where like doctor says that you have a clean bill of health. I mean, you are good, you don't have any conditions and so on. So you have good health, right? Now, wellness represents the collection of lifestyle habits, things like your attitudes, the same health. So, for example, there are some people who are healthy, but they engage in excessive consumption of sugary drinks or beverages or foods, high saturated fats. We still have a population of a subgroup of population that eats quite unhealthily. The research has shown us in 2016, 2017, I've articulated it in the policy, that we don't consume enough water, and that's a significant problem, especially in a case where you have a population that is affected by these conditions like hypertension and diabetes, which of course affect your kidneys. So your kidneys are not getting enough water. So filtration processes are affected and so on. And we do have a significant proportion of people in Barbados with kidney disease. And many of them are undiagnosed. Okay, we've seen that in a report from one of the doctors at one of the specialists at the QEH just a year or two ago. So here you have what we call unhealthy or unwell lifestyle practices. And we wanted to place the emphasis on wellness because if you see just to give you the distinction again between health and wellness, if health is where you want to be, wellness is the path that you take to get there. So, and we all know too that there are parts of our health, large parts of our health, that we don't have any control over. I mean, to be quite frank, we can do a lot of things about eating well, exercising, cutting back on alcohol, and we still come down with certain sicknesses or illnesses. And the thing about it is that that's because things like genetics and accidents and so on happen that we don't have any control over, things like environmental influences that we don't have any control over. So as my grandmother would say, that you can only deal with the things that you have control over. And that is where wellness comes in. Wellness represents those controllable things, those controllable practices that you are that you can take charge in. So The National Workplace Wellness Policy then came into being in 2019, and this was work that I started in 2016, as Ms. Farley highlighted, with the Orlando Gabby Scott, who was the then Deputy General Secretary of the Barbados Workers Union, who brought the case to me to find out whether there were other countries, this was in 2016, if there were other countries that had something called a National Workplace Wellness Policy. Excuse me. And to my surprise, I would say that there's no country, even now in 2025, that can boast that it has a national workplace wellness policy. So when we got this approved in 2019 by the government, and remember this started in 2016, so this passed hands from one administration, a DLP-led administration, to a BLP-led administration. And I remember one of the things that we said very early, because it was a small group of us that came together. And again, let me just say that this was a kind of a tripartite, well, quadripartite arrangement, because it was not just it was government that was in the fray or in the fore. We had the private sector through the Employers Confederation, Barbados Employers Confederation, and related members. We had the trade unions. So you had government, you had the trade unions, you had the employers, and I said quadripartite because we also had civil society, who played a tremendous role in terms of providing inputs into the policy. And one of the things that we said to get, going back to the point where this particular policy survived 2 administrations, was the fact that we didn't want this to be a partisan tool. We didn't want this to be a DLP-led or DLP-inspired or BLP-inspired. This was a policy for Barbadians, for people working, and it was actually categorized as a workplace wellness policy because we recognize that most of us spend a tremendous chunk of our productive and active lives in the workplace. And it also spelled out that the policy had to reflect a kind of overarching premise. And what we mean by overarching premise is that if you think about it, a school in the public sector or the private sector could come up with its own wellness policy. So a principal might say, we might get some approval from the Ministry of Education and Transformation to come up with some kind of workplace wellness policy where we might encourage teachers and even students to eat healthily and to exercise and have a few initiatives. But what I've found over the years in my research, and these are years, is that you can have these individual programs, right? These wellness programs, but the problem is that there's no kind of umbrella structure under which these programs fall, and at the same time, there's no oversight to see whether these programs are actually working. And I think that was one of the driving factors for the development of the workplace wellness policy, that it would serve, as you can see here in the diagram, as that kind of oversight umbrella under which, if let's say a school or a agency or supermarket or a small business wanted to implement, they can get input from that overarching national workplace wellness policy and the support and resources, because that's often the case that when you have these programs at the individual levels, they kind of reach a particular expiration date. So it's almost like even when you leave Christmas and you say you're going back to the gym and you spend probably January, February in the gym, and then that's it. All right, is this kind of expiration that we place on health and wellness. Sometimes people say, well, life happens, but remember, wellness is part of life. When life happens, why is it that we have to jettison or abandon those important principles? So we wanted a policy that kind of allowed for presenting that momentum or retaining that momentum, and so it doesn't, so we don't pretty much expire or we give up. So this policy will provide the needed incentives and resources and supports, all right, to fuel workplace wellness policy. So I just want to talk specifically about the background. So the policy, then think about the policy as a kind of a supporting mechanism for those individual, when I say individual level, I'm talking about enterprise level, like school level or ministerial level programs on wellness, so that they don't come across as ad hoc or just somebody pulling something out of a box or finding something on the internet and say, all right, let me just put it in the school because it worked in Georgia's high school in the US. Let me see if we can bring it to Les Devon. Okay, secondary, you know, and you don't want it to be that kind of ad hoc, kind of extempo arrangement. We want people to have kind of a planned guide on how you can actually support your wellness initiatives. Now, the goals of the policy are clear, and I should have said this. I think Rhonda, Ms. Farley made mention of this perhaps at the start. I missed some of the introduction, but the fact that we were successfully able to develop a website. Now we do have a social media presence, Workplace Wellness, the Instagram handle, I think that Workplace Wellness BB, but we have a website, workplacewellness.bb, which I'll show you at the end of this presentation. And let me just tell you this, the website has all of the resources. It has the policy, because you might be saying, but I haven't seen the policy. So he's talking about the policy, but I haven't seen it. I want it in my hand. You can have it in your hand because it's on the website, and all of the resources are there for you to download. I've actually created a small version for those who don't like reading 60-page Word documents, 60-page documents. You can go on, download it, the reduced format. I would still encourage you to read the larger version of the policy, which is the original version. I also have created a tool, an Excel tool, and there's a PDF version to it, where you actually measure wellness in your school. So for example, you're going to get to learn that there are 9 dimensions of wellness that the policy tackles. And what the tool does is that it's kind of a assessment tool. So for each dimension, it gives you 50 indicators, like a checklist, that you can actually measure your workplace against to see how much or how many of those 50 indicators for each dimension. So that's 50 by 9, 450 indicators that you've probably have met. And then that helps them informing kind of by indirectly recommendations for moving forward to achieve the other checklist items on tick that are unchecked. All right. So we have created a whole suite of resources for all of you as a teaching community in Barbados, so that you can access by way of the website and the social media handles on our National Workplace Wellness Policy. So just to go back to the substantive presentation here. So the 2 core goals, which you will read in the policy document itself, are to strategically and comprehensively guide the lower level policies, and I made mention of this, and actions aimed at supporting healthy workplaces or well workplaces. So the term well is not an adverb, it is also an adjective. We want well institutions, we want well departments, we want well people who are not just healthy, but they're well. That is, they're practicing the what we consider to be healthy lifestyle habits and behaviors and so on. The notion of the policy, and this is something that we want to kind of clarify, because when we started and when we concluded in culminating the National Workplace Wellness Policy in 2019, there was confusion that the policy, but in fact, the policy was conflated as a piece of legislation. And there is a big distinction between a policy and a legislative device, like an act that is proclaimed. All right, the policy is not legislative in the sense that there are no mandates within the policy that require employers to behave or practice in a particular way. We already have the Safety Health at Work Act, which is known as the Shaw Act, as I think most of you are familiar with. That's the kind of primary legislative device that we have for, you know, for prescribing the mandates, and of course holding employers and employees accountable, right? What we wanted was something different. We wanted something that was more developmental, educational, enabling. And I think that's where a policy comes in. A policy where a piece of legislation falls short, because all legislation does is to say, we require you to do this. But it doesn't provide the resources. It doesn't provide the support. It doesn't provide the educational components to promote what we want. So effectively, when legislation comes into play, you have to kind of ensure that your structures and your support systems are in place. And this is where policy actually meets the bill. All right. So those are effectively 2 policy goals here. You can see the last one about developing and appropriate knowledge and skills and attitudes that are supportive of and consistent with healthy living. Okay. You'll see me looking to a different screen because I'm actually working with two screens. So I'm looking at the PowerPoint as you look at it from a different screen. All right. All right. So what are the substantive elements of the policy? Now, the policy boasts that the individual or the workplace, because the individual stands as whether employee or manager or supervisor as an important element of the workplace, but you can't have a workplace without workers, right? So the policy is at the workplace level, but it obviously reaches down to the individual. And what the policy boasts are 9 dimensions of wellness. The fact that the individual is not simply a singular dimension. And I think part of the other driving or the impetus behind the policy was the fact that most workplace wellness programs, if you get to experience any of them, I found that over the years, again, this is before the pandemic, even into the pandemic, that a lot of them focus heavily on the physical and less so on the mental and other key elements beyond the physical dimension of an individual. And an individual is much more than his or her physical body. Okay. So we wanted to ensure that the wellness policy captured all of the salient and, of course, the holistic profile of a workplace and the individuals that occupy that workplace. Okay. So these are what we consider to be the 9 dimensions of wellness that the policy tackles. And each dimension, I'm going to go through each of them. Each dimension has a specific set of priorities within the policy document. And I'll explain each of them. As I said, I don't want this to be a long presentation, but we'll have a bigger conversation and you will have a larger or deeper read when you access those resources on our website, workplacewellness.bb. So the first dimension, I think, is the one that we are so familiar with, especially here in this country, is the physical wellness dimension. Now, physical wellness speaks to how we take care of our physical bodies. So things like physical exercise, things like healthy eating or nutrition, okay? But it also tackles things like what we put into our bodies. So abstaining from harmful drugs, the overuse or abuse of alcohol, illicit and legal drugs. So, I mean, alcohol is a legal stimulant, but however, it has been abused over the years and it has a tremendous adverse effect on our bodies, okay? And we are seeing a lot of new drugs, new to Barbados, creeping into our environment and affecting our youth. So we are not just affected by the harmful components of marijuana use and so on, but we're seeing a lot more dangerous and novel drugs creeping in, and how these things affect the workplace. I mean, I was talking to a guy who is in construction for the last 30 years. And he told me, but Devonish, when you go to these construction sites, a lot of these young people consuming the marijuana, and then they can't go to work. They're lethargic. They're going in and they're getting aggressive and so on. And it's not to say that marijuana, because I know that there are major proponents, even among us, about legalizing marijuana and so on. I'm a big proponent, advocate for the medical use or the medical components of cannabis. And I think that we need to get we have to clarify, and we said this, I heard this in a meeting, and it was said that I think we need to clarify exactly where the country is heading when it comes to cannabis and its legalization, and to what extent, and who is going to have the or have to meet the criteria, what kind of criteria that would need to be met when it comes to that. But I mean, when you look at it, we still have the research out there that there are significant adverse effects when it comes to marijuana use. I think the other key thing, I know that the other key aspect of the physical wellness component that the policy tackles is the whole notion that we don't get sufficient rest and sleep. The quality of sleep, and that quality of sleep is not necessarily how long you sleep, because yes, how long you sleep is important. When you have constant interruptions in your sleep patterns, that affects quality of life. It affects things like your ability to manage NCDs, and even the onset of certain NCDs like hypertension and heart disease and so on. But quality of sleep goes beyond just the duration. But we know that there are other metrics of quality in terms of your ability to go into different layers of sleep. You know, you have REM sleep, you have which is rapid eye movement sleep, okay? Where you actually your brain settles in the way, and this is where you go into the dream environment, you start dreaming and so on. And it is slow wave sleep and so on. But it is important that your sleep regulation is stable, and that allows for the restoration of cells and tissues and so on in your body. And so we're not talking about, and you might be saying, but why is it within the workplace? Not that we're promoting people to sleep at work, but we're saying that obviously the individual has or occupies different spaces, and whether the person's at home, in church, in the community, in some community workshop, those how well that person performs in those spaces is going to affect the other spaces. So if you're not getting sufficient sleep at home, it's going to affect your work productivity in the workplace. Okay, so it has to be a big feature within your work life too, in the sense that if, for example, an employer can bring in someone to talk about how you get good sleep. Now you might say, but why is the employer focusing on this? Employers focusing on this because it matters for the workplace. Yes, you might be saying, we still have this kind of traditional thinking that employers would say, when you get to work, all the problems at home, leave them at the door. I'm a teacher, so if I go to school and I have to deal with children, I have to put aside all of my problems at the door of the school. That's not true. The Dwayne Devonish that is suffering at home, that is taking care of a sick elderly father, that is going through abuse, is going to be the same Dwayne Devonish that is going to be teaching in front of a class of students. And we have to recognize that kind of interrelated environment that we live in. Okay, so it's important that that's also promoted. Now we know that people come into the workplace and they're coming in with a lot of diseases in the sense of or illnesses or conditions. So these conditions, you can't prevent them. You have to manage them. Okay. So yes, prevention is going to be has been a big tenor or crux in the policy because you want to prevent these things. But if you had a policy that was only focused on prevention, what would happen to those people that already have the conditions, that already have the heart disease, that already have kidney disease, that already have HIV? You still have to have a component of the policy that deals with how those individuals and within the workplace manage in partnership or in collaboration with employers those conditions. So on the physical side, we also spoke about in the policy itself about the need for this kind of shared responsibility between employers and employees for the management of physical illnesses. Now, we know that, of course, there's nothing that says that you have to declare that you have a physical condition. Very few occupations would require you to declare that you have this on this. And if they do, typically there's a confidentiality clause within the HR section, because HR would, for example, at university, when I started university at 21, that's 20 years ago, teaching, I had to do chest x-rays and I had to check, and that obviously the pieces of those medical information would obviously be within the conceals of the HR department. But of course, there are many things that you don't have, that is not meant for you to declare or required for you to declare. And that is your business. But what I'm saying here, there are people out there who are very okay or very fine, highlighting that, for example, they may have an illness or they may have a disability, a physical disability, because they need that additional support. They need a reasonable accommodation within the workplace. You might be a teacher who has a physical disability. You might be in a wheelchair, so you have a physical disability, or you might be blind, you might be hard of hearing or deaf. And of course, declaring that particular disability means that you should not be discriminated for it, but you should really be accommodated, for having that particular feature or characteristic within the workplace. So how do we navigate that? Those are things that we talk about in the policy and as a committee, because it's not everything you can put in the policy, as you know. So really what everything boils down to in this policy is the ability to implement. Implementation is the key thing when it comes to these things, all right? Because you can have the best looking, most articulate, structured policy, but if it doesn't have proper implementation in play, then it doesn't matter if you have a policy or not. So my main crux in developing the policy for me was to ensure that within the document, there was a kind of an implementation guidance section. And I was happy that the ministry followed a lot of what the policy highlighted by the setting up of the committee, the overall committee and the national and the subcommittee that I'm part of. So that's good. And of course, for many businesses or many organizations, not just businesses, but organizations within the public sector too, the whole push for getting people screened physically. I know, like, for example, for the police force, all right, the Barbados Police Services, there's been a bigger move for having officers being tested for different types of conditions, you know, to check their blood pressure, checking their blood glucose levels. You know, you still have, there's some tests I realize that you can test your kidneys, your creatinine levels, which is a measure of how your kidney function. And that's important that if, you know, when you're doing your full body checks, things like your liver tests and so on, your liver functioning tests and so on, that you also add in what we call your urea and creatinine tests for your kidneys and so on. So again, these things have to be done obviously within a confidential environment, but nevertheless, having that information empowers you to know exactly where you stand physically. All right. So that's going to be the big, that's the big component. Now, a second component, as I said, second dimension, because the policy speaks to all of the dimensions here, 9 dimensions, is the mental. Because remember, we are not just the physical body, we have a mental component. And this dimension focuses on your attitudes and emotions. As teachers, think about it. You come into the work environment with a particular set of emotions, thought patterns, attitudinal profiles that all shape your personality, who you are, your behaviors, and how you react, especially to children and to your co-workers and even your leadership. All right. So mental health, I think, and I don't think we needed a pandemic to flag that mental health was so important. It was unfortunate that mental health was given so much attention in the pandemic, when before the pandemic, you had very few kind of actionable initiatives on mental health. In other words, it had to take a kind of a national emergency like COVID and the pandemic to really say, oh my gosh, mental health is important. And I remember making the point during the COVID-19 pandemic, because all of a sudden I was called by so many people. I've done presentations over the pandemic period where they wanted me to talk about mental health on a panel, mental health here, mental health there. And I was reminding people that, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic will disappear at some point. This is at the heart of it. This is in 2021, early 2021, even before the vaccines. And I know I was telling them about, you know, at some point we will see the back end of this pandemic, but we will always have mental health. And that's the key thing about this, you know. The policy, when it speaks to psychological or mental wellness, suggests that all of us have mental health, you know. And there's a distinction too. I don't want people to get confused, and that's where education is important. There's a distinction between mental health, having a mental health challenge, and a mental illness. Now, usually when people see this kind of dimension, to say, you know, it doesn't affect me in the sense because I kind of don't have a mental illness, but it's not about having a mental illness. The fact is that because all of us have mental health that fluctuates, all of us are at risk of developing a mental health challenge, not necessarily a mental illness. All right. A mental illness is something that is a diagnosable condition that can only be assessed or diagnosed by what we consider to be a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist, right? A psychiatrist is a medical doctor. Yeah, that's the difference between the two, a psychologist and psychiatrist. So a psychiatrist can actually prescribe medication, all right? But the notion here is that all of us have mental health, and all of us can go through a mental health challenge in a temporary way, very temporary way, but it still affects us almost as if we have a mental illness, but not necessarily having it's almost like having the symptoms of a mental illness, but not necessarily having the mental illness. And to kind of help you understand, if you think about it logically, if you think about it from the physical side, you can have issues with your physical health, which in no way signify or signal that you have a physical illness. Like, for example, you may have a fear that you're getting up like every night and you're passing water, and then you're feeling lethargic, and you might have a fear that you have diabetes, for example, or you have a kidney issue or some bladder issue because you're passing water too regularly each night, breaking your sleep. And you go to the doctor says, well, you don't have that issue. But I realize that you're eating you might be eating some kind of high carb or something that's highly concentrated, and it's creating that, putting pressure on the kidneys or putting pressure on the bladder. And over time, but here's the thing, that is still a health challenge. You still went through a health challenge, even though you didn't have a physical illness. So all of us, many of us, go through a mental health challenge. We've gone through mental health challenges. Sometimes we don't label them as such. When we get upset and for let's say for an extended period of time, I know that during COVID, for example, people were very affected mentally, trying to navigate the online environment, dealing with the students, dealing with the parents, and now you have violence coming up because violence was the next big thing after COVID, the school violence, and those things affect your mental health. It doesn't mean that you're going to have a mental illness at the end of the day, but they're going to affect your mental health. And as long as you live, you will always have mental health, and you will always have those fluctuations in mental health. So that particular emphasis suggests that within the workplace, where you are affected by so many things, your environment, people, children, the ability to adjust to psychological, emotional challenges, to display positive thoughts and feelings, to respond positively in our attitudes and actions, to demonstrate good management of stress, okay, and of course our emotions, what we call emotional intelligence, are going to be core cornerstones of this particular dimension of psychological wellness. Okay. Now, here's the other thing, though, I want to mention. Now, I said just now that all of us have mental health, hence we all go through, over some point of our life cycle as a human, mental health challenges, but not necessarily having a mental illness. The other side of the coin is that there are some of us that do have mental illnesses. Many of them are undiagnosed, and some of them are diagnosed. And there are many people who come in to workplaces with these mental illnesses. Now, like a physical disability, that person should not be discriminated against because of that particular situation. All right. So the policy also tackles that side of affairs in the sense that recognize the same way that we say that there are people, they're not everything you can prevent when it comes to physical conditions, that people come in the workplace with physical conditions that we have to manage and work with them, to help them better take care of themselves. In the same way, we want to be able to promote good practice and good management of, not just for us as a workplace, but for those individuals taking care of their own mental illnesses. I just published, not just published, but I published one of my most recent studies, and that was in 2017, was on how managers in the public sector and the private sector, how they normally treat people with mental illnesses. And it was not surprising that many of the managers were quite informed about mental illnesses and so on, but unfortunately, they were not properly informed about how you treat to these individuals. Many people would tell you that I'm still scared to mess with somebody who they may believe or who they know very well have a mental illness in the workplace. Like, you would hear growing up as a child that if somebody has a mental illness, you would stay far from that person violent. And let me just say that there are situations where there are types of mental illnesses that have a relationship with the proclivity to engage in violent behavior. So I would never say that that having a mental illness would not, certain types of mental illness would not predispose you to certain violent tendencies, but not every manifestation of a mental illness creates an inclination to commit violence. All right. So there has to be a better educational agenda when it comes to understanding mental illnesses and the fact that you do work around people with mental illnesses, whether they're diagnosed, known or unknown, or undiagnosed, and the recognition that it works better if we can support our employees with these conditions to ensure that they're equally productive like everybody else, and that they can live positive lives in that situation. Okay. Now, Tamisha made a point, and as I said, I want this to be interactive. So as I talk about the workplace wellness dimensions, I'm always open to answering questions. So Tamisha in the chat, for those who are not following the chat yet, she asked the question, if a colleague has a mental illness that can impact their interactions with others, should all staff be made aware? No, there's no legal requirement for that disclosure. You following? So at the level of the employer, if that person discloses, that's information that's treated confidentially. Now, if there is, let's say, for example, there is some suspicion or there's a particular observance of what we call a violent interaction. Like anything, like any person who goes through perhaps some kind of mental health challenge, whether they have an illness or not. But think about it: people without mental illnesses can have issues in their mental health that affect their interactions. So are we to disclose that too, even though they're temporary and they're not illnesses? So in the same vein, we got to recognize that we still have to make sure that the environment is still safe. So it then becomes a balancing game for the employer to ensure that that other workers are also protected, but those workers who have mental illnesses are equally protected. So it's just trying to navigate that particular thing. But again, I think it's about breaking up the stigma surrounding that link between violence and mental illness.
Professor Deveness, before you go on, we have
Yes, Ms. Farley.
two raised hands. Tanya
Okay, Tanya.
was raised for well,
Okay, so we can probably have her talking if she
and
wants
then
to unmute
Sigrid
her mic.
Strawn. Tanya.
Hello,
you-
Tanya, you could go ahead.
Mhm. All right. So you can move on to Sigrid Strawn because you're not hearing Tanya.
Okay,
I'm
all right,
sorry
so
if it was me, you meant if this Tanya. Sorry,
Oh, okay,
oh, this is
sorry.
Tanya.
I didn't
All right.
raise my hand, sorry. Sorry.
Okay, hi. So Tanya, you want to ask a question? Sorry.
No, I didn't raise my hand.
Oh,
So
oh, your
see
hand
what's
was up.
going on here now.
Oh,
Well,
okay, problem. Thank you.
So the next,
Will be strong.
yeah.
Okay.
That seems to be another faulty hand raised. So we have then, there's a question in the chat,
Mhm.
Professor.
Yes, question. Yes, I'm open. Mhm.
How or where can we access the workplace wellness policy for Barbados?
Right. So
Yes, you
I
know that.
did mention that it can be
Yeah.
accessed via the website
Let me put that in.
workplacewellness.db, which I'll show at the end. Okay. So that website contains other resources beyond the policy document itself. All right. So that's the question. All right. So I'll move on then to the other dimensions. The more questions appear. So we have then the third dimension, which is the environmental wellness. This environmental wellness dimension, if you think about the first two that we discussed, the physical and the mental, those have always been kind of more familiar components of a workplace wellness program. I think what's less familiar are the others I'll discuss, but this one in particular. And this one is the environmental wellness dimension. And what this means, or what this suggests, is that all of us go into a physical environment, even if you're remote working, right? We go, if it's our houses, our workplaces, our offices, in a classroom environment, a school, or community, or church, what have you. We all are within that wider ecosystem, that physical environment. Okay, and I think this particular dimension represents the relationship between the individuals in the environment and the environment itself. The fact that we have a responsibility for ensuring that the environment, as employees and employers, that the environment is healthy, clean, and safe. When you go to school, think about it. When you go into school and you go into a classroom that is dirty, is untidy, is unsafe, because there are a lot of hazards available to be hurt or injured, it makes it difficult for you as a teacher to deliver your tuition to the classroom. Like, for example, a question that I saw just now, as I was speaking on this same environmental wellness in the chat. If you have an accident resulting in injury while in the workplace, is it legal to be discriminated against and displaced from the classroom? I think that's more a rhetorical question, because I don't think it's never legal to be discriminated against. Now, the displacement of the classroom is kind of conditional, though. Let's be fair here, because if there's an accident that rendered you kind of, let's say, disabled, all right. Now, clearly, there's a time in which you may very well have been, you may be displaced. For example, things like getting therapy or treatment. If you're talking about displacement where you're physically removed from the classroom, that has to be a conversation. Because let's say, for example, the classroom has, and this is another thing that we're going to talk about on the environmental wellness. So I'm happy that you brought the question to our attention, that do many of our schools have accessible features? Like, for example, ramps for wheelchairs. So let's say you were injured, whether you're at work or not, or whether it was at work or not, and let's say you return to work, but you're now in a wheelchair, either temporarily or indefinitely. And classrooms are not properly equipped with these accessible features, like, ramps and the bars, what we call the holding bars for you to hold on even within the classroom, and it affects your operation and then puts you at even greater risk. Then it would be prudent for some negotiation to occur, for you to be probably rerouted to some other class to protect you, and of course to ensure that current environment is brought up to scratch. Right? So I'm not sure if that's where your question is heading, but it seems to be more heading on the line of the discriminatory standpoint. So I would just give you a short answer of no, you shouldn't be. But if I add wider context, it all depends on the kind of injury that you obviously incurred, right? But just going back to the environmental wellness component, so if you think about environmental wellness then, and the fact that how we take care of our environments, how we ensure that our environments are accessible, a lot of people don't kind of link that particular dimension to things like how we ensure our environment is safe and clean and clear. When people think about environmental wellness, people think about the wider environment. But what we're talking about here in this wellness policy is the fact that the environment, which is under the responsibility of the employer, but also in a very small way under the responsibility of you as employees too, teachers. Okay, so you two play a role in ensuring that the environment is safe and clean by reporting when you see that there are particular risks or hazards that can present injury or possible injury to co-workers or yourself. All right, so there is that responsibility built in, and the fact that there's also the other side of things, because I don't think it's no secret that there are many schools physically that suffer from mold infestation, so poor air quality. We've had a number of media reports over the last couple of years, and longer than that, on how schools had to shut down. The ministry had to shut schools because they were improper, when it came to the physical environment, whether it be a mold issue or an issue with air quality, or something that where people were being affected, their skin or respiratory health was being affected. And again, it's not just schools. We have a lot of private and public sector buildings, either because of poor design and construction, and for the latter part, the maintenance is very important. There are many schools, for example, that really require a proper maintenance schedule and maintenance implementation. So that's why it's important. And I know that a lot of that is not under the responsibility, when it comes to the primary schools especially, is under the responsibility of the Ministry of Education Transformation, that you have to take very strategically as a ministry, that, as much emphasis when we talk about educational transformation, and I made this point very clearly in the past, that it's not just about what happens in the classroom and the pedagogical side of things, and the common entrance and changing up the structure of the schools or the grade system or what have you, but also transformation speaks to the wider environment, the physical environment. If you're going to do transformation, then make sure that these schools are in proper shape, coming back from the summer. I know all of you are now coming back in, getting ready to go into schools and so on. So during that summer period, and have a kind of a proper, not just a maintenance schedule when it comes to school, but ensure that the people who are conducting the maintenance are doing the right things, because that's another thing that we have to talk about. All right, the fact that you have the right people with the right skills maintaining the schools, ensuring that it's a comprehensive maintenance. It just doesn't tackle just cleaning the schools, but it talks about how you put things like ventilation and checking the walls and the air quality. All of those things are part of when we talk about wellness. I'm following the comments as I speak, or the questions that are coming out of the comment section here. Andrew, thank you for your question. Under the wellness policy, is there a requirement? Now, remember, the policy doesn't make mandates. It's not a piece of legislation, so it can't require anything. But what the policy does do is that it does advocate for a maintenance schedule for all buildings, not just public buildings, right? Even private ones, right? Because if you're working from home, one of the things that it would promote for you is that you keep your home equally clean, equally safe. Because if that's your not just your living space, is your working space, you want to also be you want your environment to be devoid of any risks as well, right? Because you could be sick at home because of the environment. So it has to be kind of a consistent, conscious, comprehensive regime or agenda that has to take on the point. Now, if your question probably begs a different question in the sense that is the Ministry of Education Transformation following these advocacies initiatives or these particular promotional gestures that the policy is making? Not necessarily the case. As you know, the ministry still has its own policy. It still follows this particular set of regulatory practices. It's still being informed by the Shaw Act, because the Shaw Act applies to all types of workspaces, and it has to ensure that maintenance is done. So I don't think the question probably is whether we have this requirement. The question is whether we are practicing it. Because as I tell people, as many legislative devices, as many policy frameworks that you put into place, they really, if you think about the human condition, is really about the implementation, it's about putting things in practice. You can have all of these schedules, you can have all of these things in play, but you have to have people who are acting and who are putting these things into practice. Okay. All right, so that's environmental wellness. Now the next dimension we have is social wellness, and I'll treat to some of the other questions that I see coming up. I see Cardine, you're making probably a more specific point, but I'll get to it very soon. But I want to talk about social wellness. Social wellness speaks to the other side of our lives as teachers, for example, and that's the social side. The fact that we don't think, when we think about wellness, we don't naturally think about the social. I just mentioned just now, we don't, less so we think about things like the environment. But then we say, oh, that makes sense. That's why there's such a thing called environmental wellness. But when you think about social wellness, when I talk about our social, I'm talking about social relationships within the workplace are critical to our wellness as well. There are many teachers, for example, I can tell you, I've done the first study of several first studies in different areas on different fronts on workplace bullying. Workplace bullying is kind of a form of harassment where you as a teacher, for example, it doesn't matter if you're a teacher, it could be any type of occupational category, where you feel that you're being in some way intimidated, harassed, negatively affected by not just students, but other teachers, people in leadership positions in the school, and it has an effect on your mental health. So social wellness has a connection with your mental wellness. And if you look at it from the inverse or the positive side, how well you relate to others affects your health and wellness. How healthy are your interpersonal relationships at work? That affects your wellness. And so this particular dimension of wellness looks at improving those features, those interpersonal relations, the communication. There are people at school who will not talk to you. I'm talking about other co-workers. They might be leaders because of some kind of injury that they've suffered from you. Like when I say injury in this case, I'm talking about some offense that they probably are front that was slighted on them. And because of that, they're not talking to you, and you might say, well, I don't care. But to the extent to which the impaired communication affects your duties, because you may be dependent, because there's one thing to say, well, I don't care if she talks to me, but if her particular role, her professional role, affects your role in the sense that transcends beyond the personal into the professional, which affects your mobility in the workplace in terms of how you advance or where you go, or the rewards that you expect, it can be deleterious. So whether we like it or not, it is going to affect your health and wellness. So the whole notion of how we allow teachers, for example, to better manage conflict. So we talk about conflict resolution often among the youth, we talk about, the young people today are very violent, they're committing crimes and so on. They need conflict resolution. And I always make the point, but there are many adults that need conflict resolution. They can't manage conflict. They don't even know how to resolve conflict. And they think that their way of resolving conflict is a healthy way, right? And so then you have a lot of toxicity in the particular environment that you don't need to have, And I've heard a lot of these social media labels being thrown around. People narcissistic, the gaslighting, and these terms at some point were within the preserve of psychologists, but now they've gone into a larger preserve in the public space where everybody uses the term, but those terms are really psychological medical terms. But needless to say is that this toxic environment that people are now kind of consuming in themselves. When they go home, they feel it. When they go to church, they feel it. When they go with the children, they feel it. And sometimes when you get aggressive with your spouse or your partner or your children, and you think very reflectively and deeply, then you realize a lot of these things may very well stem from your environment in the school space or in the working environment. And so we have to understand that the social side, your social relationships, your communication, quality, connections, and generally your interpersonal space those things play a significant role on your mental health, your relationships outside of school as well. So again, I think we wanted this to be a critical dimension. Now, the other dimension, again, this is where it gets less and less familiar. This is called intellectual wellness. And many of you may not be familiar with this, but I came across this particular dimension in 2017 or 18 when I was pulling together one of the dimensions. And intellectual wellness is really, I think it's intuitive in the sense that intellectual wellness is really about how a person working in an environment, let's say a teacher again, using you as the example, you having that not just the capacity, but having an environment where you feel safe to engage in innovative and creative abilities in the workplace. Not just to grow your knowledge or skills, but to kind of perfect your craft. Like, for example, I've heard many teachers argue that, they were taught many things at school when in their training. Let's say if you've gone to teachers training college, Ernestine, for example, or you did a master's or bachelor's in teaching or education or what have you, that when they go into the school environment, sometimes they feel that the environment does not allow them to implement a lot of the things that they learned. And they feel that and many argue that it's probably the system, the culture, the structure, the ministry doesn't allow this and so on. And they feel that there's this constraining of their intellectual capital. So that's where intellectual wellness speaks about. And you might say, but how does this connect to wellness? This doesn't sound like wellness. But if you think about what wellness means, remember I painted the definition at the very start. Wellness looks at your well-being. Oftentimes, people who feel that they are frustrated, that they're in a tight box, that they don't have the ability to be innovative and creative, do you know that those things affect your mental health? Yes, they do. That's why there are people who stay in the school system. They might move from one school to the next school, and they would tell you, Devonish, I just want you out of this system. I would like you to leave Barbados. Because they feel that they're not growing and they feel intellectually, I call it intellectually frustrated. All right. So there is that kind of connection between intellectual capacity or enabling and wellness, and that's what we call intellectual wellness. So on what this policy then advocates for is for ministries in the public space, schools, secondary schools, as you know, they're run by a board, that those persons in the leadership positions, that they create that enabling environment to allow teachers to be able to apply things that they've learned, obviously not just to their benefit, but to the benefit of the children or the students under their care. Okay. The other thing about intellectual wellness that is also important, something that I just missed, is the fact that intellectual wellness also speaks to the fact that the school and the ministry should also have an opportunity or invest in an opportunity for teachers themselves to be trained in other areas that may not necessarily be requirements, but could very well complement the role that teachers play. Like, for example, I know teachers that would tell me that, I wanted to get a scholarship or I wanted to do something, train in this particular area. I had a very good friend of mine who wanted to look at getting a training when it comes to, training, educating children with dyslexia and so on, and other types of special needs. And the thing about it is that you can have a situation where that person may have to pay for everything. They may have to spend it. And we're not advocating that the government has to give you money for everything you do. I mean, the things that remember, this is a shared responsibility, but you have to go beyond the short term as a country or as a government to recognize that if you want to talk about education transformation, it means that you also have to put in place training opportunities for teachers to access, that they can develop themselves in a more holistic way, beyond the narrow the narrow preserves of teaching or pedagogical applications. All right. So we had physical wellness, mental wellness. We had the environmental, social, intellectual. Occupational wellness is a favorite of mine. This dimension speaks largely to what I consider to be the personal satisfaction that workers experience within their workplace. So if you think about things like what is your morale at school? How satisfied are you with your job? What level of work-life balance have you been achieving over the period of time as a teacher? How satisfied are you with your career and the way it's heading or growing, if it's growing or not? Those questions then fall under the remit of occupational wellness. So occupational wellness is the kind of that relationship between your personal satisfaction with your job, what you do. Not necessarily, remember we talk about environment, not necessarily how satisfied you are with your body or your mental health or how satisfied you are with the physical environment. We're talking about your job, what you do, okay? Not your intellectual side, because that's only one aspect of your job, but your job, your occupation. And the reason why it's connected to wellness is that, there are people who are very dissatisfied with many of these things. Things like their morale is very low, job satisfaction is very low if it even exists. Your work-life balance is not properly balanced. In that way, you feel that your career has reached a particular impasse. So in many cases, that these particular negative observances can also play a toll or have a significant toll or heavy toll on other aspects of your health and wellness. And again, I guess this is where the message comes in for the policy, that how do employers in partnership with their employees promote that kind of positive morale, positive job satisfaction, increase work-life balance. All right. Okay. Right. So Andrew, you asked the question. Well, clearly, Andrew, there will be overlap, and the overlapping is really overshadowed by the fact that they're related, not necessarily that they're saying the same thing. So you made the point, you asked the question, wouldn't occupational wellness come under mental wellness? No, not necessarily. Because remember, your mental wellness goes beyond your occupation. Because if you have a problem at home that's affecting your mental health, you bring it to the workplace. Yes, it can affect your occupational wellness too. You follow? But they're two separate things. Okay. And in the same vein, you could have a situation, and let me show you how these wellness dimensions are different. You could have a situation where you may have very good mental health. So your mental health is really, really good. But then you feel stuck in your career because your mental health is good in a particular area of your life, but you feel stuck in a particular area. Or vice versa, you may have very good occupational health. Let's say you had a situation where you were growing, you're getting your master's, you're getting promoted to senior teacher, you love your job, you love the children, but you are having some problems at home. You're having some problems navigating probably a health challenge that you have. Those things can still be distinct, but that's what I'm saying, that when we talk about overlapping, we're not talking about overlapping here. We're talking about that they're related, that one thing can affect the other, but because one thing can affect the other doesn't mean that they are all the same. They're still independent elements of your health that can be affected differentially. All right. Going to the question by Joyanne quickly, who has the responsibility, or what is the responsibility of the Ministry of Education in regards to the wellness policy? Now, just to note that the National Workplace Wellness Policy is under the responsibility as by way of implementation, that is, of the Ministry of Labor, Social Security, and the third sector. But what the particular remit is that as the Ministry of Labor being the oversight ministry, the forging of relationships with other ministries to bring them into awareness of the policy and what the policy prescribes or describes in terms of wellness is more kind of leveraging partnerships. Remember, this is not really a requirement of other ministries, but the fact that we're promoting it to ensure that other ministries take it seriously and go on board. This is all we can do, when it comes to policy. All right. You can't force a man or force a woman or force a ministry to say, well, you have to do it unless it's a legislative device. All right. And it's not a legislative device. It is something to promote that kind of awareness and that culture over time when it comes to wellness implementation. Now, the other side of the other dimension, remember we have 9 dimensions, is the spiritual wellness. Spiritual wellness, this is one that I kind of added late. And there was a bit of, I guess, contention or controversy at the start of it, because many were arguing that, not everybody is a religious person, not everybody believes in God and so on. And that's not exactly what the spiritual wellness component is, because when you see it at face value, it kind of connects to kind of a Christian or a religious particular agenda. And that's not what we wanted. You can have this particular perception because of the culture that we are in, especially in this predominantly Christian society that we call Barbados. But if you are a Christian, you can take it as it is, because spiritual wellness is your own personal connection. It is for every human being. There's this deeper search for meaning in our lives and our overall purpose for existence. And we think about it, we do different things to kind of validate our existence or our purpose. And not all of that has to do with our religious intervention. All right. You see, the notion of spiritual wellness is a set of guiding beliefs, principles, and values. All of us have values, even though we say we don't have, people don't have values. This person doesn't have values, but all of us have a sense of a set of values that kind of inform our lives, right? And things like, whether we have a capacity for love. When you think somebody, like you might meet somebody who doesn't love, that person doesn't have any love in their heart. Trust me, if you look much deeper to somebody that person may have loved before has, they may tell you it might be their child that they love very much. And that's part of the human condition. There's also capacity for compassion. There's capacity for forgiveness, altruism, doing things for not expecting something in return, which is what we consider to be altruism. Thinking and speaking and acting in ways. I think that's the crux or the tenor of this particular dimension. The fact that thinking and speaking and acting in ways that are consistent with your spiritual beliefs and values. You want to be in a workplace where you feel that there's this kind of relationship between how you think, how you work, your personal lives. You should not be behaving in a particular way that you find that runs counter to what you stand up or believe in. There are people, we know that there are some people who are social butterflies in a sense. And I'm using the word social butterflies as a pejorative in this sense, that they would be, let's use the term Christian. They would be very Christian at home. And when they get to work, man, they're cursing like a pirate, and they don't have any qualms about it. There's no conviction or what have you. But there are people who are affected in particular ways who feel that they're doing things that may run counter to what they believe in. Now, I want to kind of tread lightly here, or perhaps tread carefully here, in the sense that we're not saying that if I use the term Christian here, remember, it's not speaking to spiritual wellness, I'm just using an example here. If I use the term Christian, that we're saying that the workplace or employers should accommodate the Christian faith and Christian principles. So, for example, I remember a young lady told me once that she's 7 Days Adventist, and she had an arrangement with the hotel. She was working at a hotel, and this arrangement under a previous management structure was that she would not be scheduled to work on Friday evenings, or Saturdays. And that arrangement survived for a while, and then there was a change in management, and the new management came in and said, but to be quite frank, we are a hotel, we operating 24 hours in this high season, we're in December, and we got a schedule to work thing. And she said, but this can't work. And, she had to leave the hotel. And, there's so many counter arguments that can be made in this regard, that the hotelier should have really made a case, but, if you have a situation where let's say you had a lot more 7 Days Adventists coming in, and the hotel is having that requirement in place, I think it's fair to recognize that it is both not just the responsibility of the hotel, but of the person. And I keep telling people this, if you are going into an environment, let's say you're going to apply for a job, it's not just the job choosing you, you are also choosing the job. So when you decide to accept the offer for employment and say, okay, I'm going to go in this job, you are making that choice to go into the job. And granted that many of us don't know the whole culture, so we only get into there, realize, oh shoot, we made a mistake. But in many cases, you ask those questions, ask as many questions as you can to find out exactly if it is a perfect fit for you. All right, because it would be unfair for employer to accommodate every request that you have. Let's say there were Muslims that came in, Hindus that came in. Does it mean that the employer has to accommodate every whim? All right. So in the spiritual wellness, that's why we say that this is not about just religion. This is not religious wellness. We're talking about the fact that the employer and employee has to still come some kind of middle ground when it comes to ensuring that the workplace still allows people to express themselves and their values. As long as those values, by the way, do not infringe on others. Okay? Because I know that there's certain religious appeals that may very well infringe on others because people might want this and that may affect other people in the workplace. All right, and we're not going to get into that because that could be controversial, but just bear in mind that this is not meant to be a controversial dimension, but something that recognizes that we are not just physical beings, that there's that kind of deeper connection that we strive to reach. All right, and then we had cultural wellness. Cultural wellness is the 8th dimension, and this one was added because the recognition that our wellness is tied to our culture, right? The fact that how aware, how knowledgeable we are of our own culture and how that those values, those norms, those behaviors and practices can affect our health and wellness either adversely or positively is an important component, all right? The other thing about cultural wellness is our desire to learn more about other cultures. There are people who go into the workplace and they have different backgrounds. They come from different backgrounds. They come from different ethnicities, for example, sexual orientations, genders, religion, affiliation, age groups. And we talk a lot about the Gen Zs and the millennials versus the baby boomer teachers and those types of things. And if they still are teaching baby boomers, but the Gen Xs. At the end of the day, we have to work in the same space. We all have different value systems. And whether we think that this group is lazy or this group doesn't have any stickability because they always jump from here to there, or whether you think that the older generation doesn't think or they're very slow to change and those types of things. At the end of the day, you have to work with these individuals. And I think cultural wellness is about understanding these differences, recognizing that diversity is critical, equity and inclusion, and leveraging those particular elements as assets rather than seeing them as liabilities. Okay. And you can go deeper in terms of when you look at the checklist that I developed, you'll get an idea of what cultural wellness and all the other dimensions, by the way. And for those who probably came in late or joined late, if you're on YouTube, welcome. The fact that I mentioned at the start of this whole conversation on national workplace wellness and the fact that we have a policy that very few people know about. And that we're the first country in the world to boast such a policy, that we do have a website that you can have further information. You can get deeper information on the National Workplace Wellness Policy, which is Workplace Wellness PB. Now, the last dimension, and I'm going to stop here because I know time is getting away from us, is financial wellness. And financial wellness is the 9th and final dimension. This was added a bit late in 2018, I think. I think I added this from some research that we did with consultations with the workers union and the employers. And one of the things that I think was important that was highlighted, and of course that justify the inclusion as a dimension, is the fact that we as workers, we are also affected by our financial health. And when we talk about financial health, it speaks to the fact that if you have an individual who is living paycheck by paycheck, I mean, you could be a teacher and you might be thinking that you're being paid well. And I always say it's a misnomer, when people say I'm paid well, because I've seen people who've been paid $20,000, $30,000, it's all relative. But then at the end of the day, based on sometimes poor financial management or poor financial literacy, that they only end up with $1,000 or $500 left back to pay a mortgage or a light bill. you know, and I'm saying to myself, but you know, people will say, but if you compare somebody who has, you know, who's working for $1,500, let's say a school meal server who might be working for $2,000 a month, and probably a senior teacher is working for this, and but you realize that the person who's a school meal server is able to manage their finances. Now you may argue, obviously, the hidden variables in there is the fact that usually when your income increases, you kind of increase your expenses, and then you put yourself into particular, you know, you're qualified for mortgages, but then that creates a debt profile that then kind of elevates credit cards and so types of things. But I think much deeper than to this is that, and I'm going to be very frank here, especially those in the larger population of the Afro community, right? Many of our families, the kind of households that we come out of, I don't think we were properly exposed, if exposed at all, to what I consider to be good financial management. We might have, like me, I have a grandmother that was a very good financial manager. I mean, she was working at Paradise Hotel. When Paradise Hotel was actually operational in the 80s and going into the early 90s and so on. When you, and that was where Four Seasons should have been, there by Spring Garden, Mighty Grinder roundabout, coming down up to Black Rock. She was able to $30 a week. And she was able to, you know, build her home and so on. Didn't owe a bank a cent. No, many could argue, but you know, that's, you know, the probably was cheaper back then and so on. But I think that there is some kind of lesson that can be learned from many of the older people, not all of them, but many of the older people, about how we manage finances. I find that we get into a particular environment now where we spend beyond our means. So you want the bigger houses, you want the bigger this, you want the bigger car, and you spend the money. And as I said, coming from the Afro-Caribbean communities across not just in Barbados, but beyond the Caribbean, within the Caribbean especially, sorry, and even the diaspora, is that we've never had a kind of a good handle on how to manage money, how to manage debt. And we've had this kind of toxic relationship with managing income and money and debt, to the point that we don't understand it. And we are on the unfortunate side, we are on the poor side of that relationship, okay? When it comes in a relationship with our money. And I think there is then a space and an opportunity for those in charge, and even for ourselves, to take or avail ourselves to financial wellness initiatives that build our literacy as adults in terms of how we manage our monies, our finances, our debts, you know. And again, you might say, but why is this within the workplace? It is important for the workplace to be part of that, because the workplace is by virtue your financier, and that means that they pay your salaries. Not to say that they're the ones to kind of increase your salaries when you want to have the salaries increase, but I've seen many workplaces who undergo training for their workers in terms of how to manage your finances. Now, you might say, but that's not their business. But it becomes their business when your financial struggles leak into the organization, and it affects your productivity, and it affects other things that may very well kind of disturb the welfare of the workplace. So you have to, I mean, there is that shared responsibility that has to take to the fore between you as the employee and your employer. How am I gonna improve the management of my finances and my debt? And the other thing I should say, that this also includes things like your retirement planning. There's so many people who are leaving the work environment or the employment context, going into retirement, and they're in a financially worse situation. You see, one would have expected that when you are on the brink of retirement, that you have a nest egg, you have, savings, and you have investments put aside, so that when you go into retirement now, you can enjoy your retirement, in a healthy way. And unfortunately, there are many people who are leaving the work environment and they're going into retirement and they're broke, because of, again, poor financial decisions that were made, and because of low literacy, and they find themselves in trouble. So and again, a pension is not a survivable wage for many people. I can tell you, especially with the rising cost of living, as you know, in Barbados. So we have to go beyond just the pension. I always say a retirement saving is much more than just a pension. It looks at all types of investments that you may take on board. And I've seen the University of West Indies, what they do now is to do a lot of workshops even for younger people, because we think that you have to plan for retirement at 45 and 55 and 60. You have to plan for retirement for the time you enter the workplace. If you're 21, I started work at 21 at university, and I had to think about retirement, and that's something that I was happy to kind of had that exposure at the university to have access to that type of initiatives, financial literacy initiatives, and so on. Okay, so there you have it, and I'm not going to go any further. Just to say that within the policy, there's a particular implementation plan. Remember, I told you that all of this goes to naught if implementation is not properly taken seriously. So what I did in 2019, I actually developed my own implementation framework. I wrote a few papers on it. It's called the 4E approach. And just quickly, the 4E approach is about how you go about implementing anything, whether it's a policy or any device, right? So educating is the first element of implementation. You have to educate people. Let's talk about education transformation. If you're talking about changing the educational affairs of the country, the system, the sector, what have you, and you have to be able to educate the different stakeholders. Because oftentimes, as you know, when you're trying to transform or implement something, you're going to be butt with some level of resistance. And oftentimes that resistance is a function of ignorance, is a function of a lack of trust. All right. Not just trust in the players, but sometimes trust in the players' ability to implement. If you don't believe that the ministry, for example, has the capacity to kind of pull off what we construe as an educational transformation initiative at a national level, then it's going to affect your ability to buy in to it. Think about it. That's a very serious point. So what I always advocate that if you're implementing something, you have to educate people, not just for educating them sake, but educating them to bring them into awareness of the fact that, that they themselves need skills and competencies to kind of tackle this, because sometimes we resist because we don't have these skills. And it's kind of a defense mechanism that is enacted when you don't have skills, when you feel inadequate, that you kind of react. Or it could be a situation where the ministry themselves need to kind of rebuild trust. And by educating people and communicating with people, right? Allowing people to ventilate. That's all part of education too, because education is a two-way street. We don't just educate children. Children also in some way in the classroom help us reflect and see how to improve ourselves as teachers. So there's that kind of two-way relationship that's developed. The second E is important because when I created this framework, I wanted to kind of demonstrate that in implementation, you can't just educate and stop there. You have to also create an enabling environment. If you don't enable, that is where you educate people, but then you constrain them by not giving them the resources. That's what we call educating, but not enabling, right? So I thought that having an enabling environment at the same time, engaging in education is going to be important by having the requisite support systems and opportunities for teachers and for the wider ministry to pursue wellness. And then the other thing is the engaging. Engaging, which is the third E, is about involving people. You have to involve people. So if you talk about educational reform, it's not sufficient to educate them, to enable them. And I'm using education transformation, right, as the example, but you bear in mind that this is something that I'm talking about in terms of wellness as well, right? So you could apply this, as I said, to any agenda, all right? So involving people allows for a better buy-in, because when you involve people, not at the end, but at the outset, it helps in securing buy-in, because then it doesn't come across as you are foisting something on me. So it becomes them versus me, or them versus us. It becomes ours. When you involve people, there's this shared ownership that can creep in. And then finally, all these three E's that I just spoke about will be insufficient for successful implementation if you don't have encouraging. And encouraging is about ensuring the right incentives and reward systems or structure is in place for people to kind of build first a motivation and a desire to be part of this whole thing. And two, it reinforces. When you encourage, when you incentivize, it reinforces people to engage in the behaviors that you want them to engage in. Okay. Now, finally, I just want to close off by saying thank you so much for listening in on this very important subject on the National Workplace Wellness Policy, but also to recognize that there is, as I said, a website. And this is the website here. I already have it open. And this is our website, Workplace Wellness BB, workplacewellness.bb. You can see here the 9 dimensions, You can go here to resources where there are videos and documents, as I said, that you can download, and feel free to avail yourselves to these elements. So thank you so much, everyone, and I look forward to any questions that I may have missed and any questions that you have. While you get ready, Rhonda, you can come on, but I can see a few questions here in the chat.
Yes. There are a couple in the Q&A too as well.
Mhm.
That would have been there before, so. The first one in the Q&A.
Mhm. Yes.
This person is asking about if the policy addresses having a health insurance policies for teachers or workers in the frontline workers.
Well, it encourages. I think one of the key things that I think when we started the policy work in earnest in 2016-17, we wanted to kind of consider the fact that the insurance sector, the health insurance sector in particular, would be a key stakeholder, because when we think about health insurance specifically, this is an important instrument for many people, especially for giving them that level of security that, let's say, for example, there's an injury or there's some kind of affirmity that they don't have to take a bulk of their savings, that there's some coverage. And this all is promoting wellness. Now, by way of the suggestion that does it make it a requirement for teachers to have access to health insurance, the policy doesn't make any inroads or suggestions as to specifically how health insurance is acquired. I don't think it would be for the policy to say that the ministry shouldn't do it. But what if is encouraging that health insurance might be a good avenue, especially if you know that you don't have sufficient financial resources in the case where you get really ill. You have an issue with cancer, for example, and you have to go and pull a whole set of like savings, and that affects you and all kinds of things. It is always wise or prudent to have those types of devices, especially, and make sure that you sit down with your insurance agent. Now, I'm not here to sell any insurance agency, but just to say that I've seen it work for many people who were able to kind of protect their life savings and let their insurance to kick into play or come into play to protect them or to help them in a particular medical crisis or medical emergency. That is something that they would probably have to have a conversation with in terms of government.
Yes. The second question, what happens if after being hired, the employer changes terms and conditions without consultation?
What happens if the employer changes the terms and conditions?
Yeah, after being hired, the terms and
Well, I
conditions.
mean, but that's a serious thing, because I mean, I think if there's a contractual instrument in place, and that's the other thing. I mean, contracts are very important, right? I mean, I've seen people tell me that they're hired, and by oral tradition, they're given this set of responsibilities, but it's just oral. There's no written document, no written contract, and then it changes. I mean, that's very hard to prove, but I assume that what the person's suggesting is that there's a contract in place, and if there's a contract in place, that means that there's a legal precedent. All right. So if there is that belief or perception that there is a kind of a reneging on the contractual obligations on the employer side, I imagine that there are avenues that can be taken legally or otherwise for some kind of redress or some kind of resolution. So, I mean, I would just encourage them to take that route, but perhaps to kind of first open up that conversation with the manager or the employer, because I can be quite frank, because there are situations where many employers do acts of things of their employees, and in a kind of a, how can I put this, not in a deliberate or kind of malevolent way. In other words, they're not, in many cases I find that they're not doing it deliberately. Sometimes it's because of ignorance. Sometimes they're not following the contract, and they say, oh, and it's important. That's why communication is so important. Now, if you've brought it to their attention that, this, what you're asking me is a violation or is moving away from the terms and conditions, and then they're kind of resistant, then, as I said, you go through those natural channels of justice, which I know is afforded by legislation that we have.
Yeah, the Employment Rights Act.
Yeah.
Okay, there's another question in the chat. In what ways does the school measure or assess cultural wellness, and how are the results used to improve the school climate and support diversity? Ms. Diane Anderson.
Okay, so in what ways does the school measure or assess? Right. Well, that's the thing. So just so I can better understand, well, not, I kind of clarifying the question. Is the policy necessarily, not the school, is the policy that tells you how you can go about assessing cultural wellness. I don't know right now, and I don't think so, that schools that fall under the ministry or a particular board structure, if you're in secondary school, that school have any requirement to assess cultural wellness, right? The reason why we have a policy now is that we can say, you know what, if the ministry had to conduct, and it really, the policy really makes a case for conducting what I call a wellness assessment. And I should have said this at the start, but using it on a different hat, I'm actually working with the Ministry of Education Transformation in conducting a wellness survey of schools very soon. So very soon, I'm not sure, not every school will be obviously under the audit, but very soon you will probably have enumerators come in to the schools evaluating not just teaching staff, but non-teaching staff as well. Different dimensions of wellness, but that's a particular commercial venture that I'm on with the Ministry of Education Transformation as a consultant, in a different kind of related hat, looking at school wellness, right? So that's something that will happen, all right? But with the policy now, there is a kind of a precedent that can be set that schools can actually, be measured in terms of cultural wellness. Now, remember the same website that I demonstrated, that I showed on the screen. If you go to the resources, there's a particular, as I said, checklist measurement device that I created last year that actually shows you how to measure cultural wellness. So you can actually use it for yourself. So I developed them so that they can be worker friendly. So you don't have to be an expert to use them. Okay. All right. I hope that helps, Diane. Over to you, Rhonda. Yeah.
All right. I think the last point there was they wanted to have access to the PowerPoint presentation.
Oh,
That
for
is
sure.
Yes.
I'll
So
send
what
that.
we do- Yes, we can share that with the ministry and have them share the presentation with the schools.
Mhm.
Because we would not have access to your email addresses saying that persons did not have to register for this forum. So we can share the information with the schools through the ministry and ask them to share the presentation then with the principals and the schools. So I think there
Okay.
are more, the Q&A has in some more questions before we go, or?
Yeah.
Okay, somebody is asking if you can use your screen to show the checklist, the assessment tool.
Oh, the checklist.
Yeah.
So I'll do that now.
Okay.
You're saying it, Rhonda? So on the
Charmaine
website,
Gill, so you can say if you're seeing it, Charmaine. Let me see.
well, I'm actually showing the website section where you can access this checklist. So you can see here, wellness assessment action planning tool.
Should be.
So you can download it. You see the download tab here. If you download it, there's a PDF version. I'm wondering, let me see if I see, and there's an Excel version. The Excel version, what I did is that I placed some macros that allow you to, when you start assessing, oh yes, a minute, let me just make sure the well, man. Assessment.
And we have one person who has.
Oh yes, here it is. Okay, here it is. Yeah. So there's the Excel version here. So there's the Excel version allows you to kind of measure. And what it does, it actually scores the school. Let's say it's a school that you're measuring or a department, what have you, and gives you a score out of 50. Because remember, each dimension has 50 checklist indicators. So you might get like a 50%, which means that you probably kind of knock off 25 out of the 50, right?
We have one person with the hand raised. I don't know if that, Charmaine, if that is sufficient for you in terms of you, but we have one person who, let me see that she's saying. Yeah, she said thanks, she can see it on the screen. I thought that's sufficient. So we have, yes, the mic is open. See, Blackman, we don't hear you. Or do you want to put your question in the chat? Okay. We're not hearing C. Blackman. So let me just take then this, if there are no more questions, this opportunity once again to thank you, Professor Devonish, for delivering this always informative and educational presentation, and to thank the Ministry of Educational Transformation and all of the teachers and any non-teaching staff that have joined us this morning for participating in this forum. We're very happy that you could join. I'm looking at a question, trying to finish. We're very happy that you can join. You can join us this morning. The checklist manageable to do at the individual level. Sorry, I was looking at Joyanne's question.
Yeah, Joyanne, the answer is yes.
Yes.
Just go to it and you'll see how easy it is to navigate. For
So
sure.
right, for the ministries, and we want to encourage, even for the Ministry of Education, really to look at the policy seriously and to see how we can encourage our schools across the island to take a deeper dive into workplace wellness, because that is something that for all of our well-being that can improve not only at the individual level but at the institutional level, and everything at the end of the day redounds to the benefit of the society if we are all well and focusing on our well-being. So, and even in terms of we speak a lot about mental health, so improving that along the way. So with those few words, let me not keep you all back any longer. It's about 12 minutes
Yes.
after 11. So thank you all very much for
Thank
joining
you.
us. If you want any additional information, the website is there. Feel free to reach out. You can reach out to me at the Ministry of Labor on the 535-1407. So thank you all very much for joining us.
Have a great one,
Have a
everyone.
great day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.